So today's talk is recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube probably later today or early next week. So if you do not want to be on YouTube, please keep your camera off during the talk. And if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat function. Um, or you could turn your camera on and put your hand up if you want to, but you will be on YouTube then. So if you have questions and you don't want to be on YouTube, you can put it in the chat function. And then we'll have time for questions after the talk, but we'll stop the recording at that point in time and then have sort of Q&A after the talk, which will be um for everyone to be able to ask questions without worrying that we're recording it and it will go up on YouTube and stay there forever. So that is what we're going to do today. And now briefly, I am going to talk you through what the Engage with DLD project is for those who are unaware of the project. So Engage with DLD is the first international database of individuals with DLD. So we are targeting recruitment of parents of children with DLD under the age of 18, actually, or really under the age of 16, and individuals with DLD over the age of 16. So 16 is the age of consent in the UK, which is why we're targeting 16 plus individuals to join E-DLD. And then we advertise ethically approved research projects. I'm just going to sort of give an illustration of how this works. So we have the parents of children with DLD and adults or individuals with DLD over the age of 16 sign up to E-DLD. So you fill in a form and say you want to join E-DLD. And then we have researchers with DLD projects also email us or contact us and give details about their projects that they would like advertised. And to do this, they need to show that they have ethically approved DLD research projects. So we won't advertise any projects that don't have ethical approval from a validated ethics research board. And then we send out monthly or quarterly emails to all of our participants. So we collate the information that the researchers give us, put it into an email, and then we email out the parents and the adults with DLD. And then, oops, they can contact, if they want to, the researchers with DLD projects. Um, so it's up to all the DLD members whether they have the capacity to and whether they have the ability to participate in the research project. And the research project should be listing the specific criteria for inclusion, so the specific details of who they're looking for the projects. And sometimes we also ask your opinions and your own research ideas as well as part of the Engage with DLD project. Okay, so I think, and this is how you sign up. So I'll leave this here while I introduce Professor Krishnan. So if I can get my details up. She is Professor of Developmental Language Sciences at University College London. And she's a cognitive neuroscience. And for those who don't really understand what cognitive neuroscience is, it's basically that cognitive neuroscientists study how our brain learns to process and use language. So in terms of Professor Krishnan's specific focus, it's on language learning, and it's how our brains are actually doing the access of processing language and learning language. And she received a doctorate from Birkbeck University and had postdoctoral positions at UCL and then the University of Oxford. Um, and then moved to Royal Holloway and quickly got promoted to from a lecturer to reader and then professor, and then moved back to UCL as professor of developmental language sciences. So that is sort of what Professor Krishnan comes from. And then her current research is focusing on the cognitive and neuromechanisms that underpin language learning, particularly in adults with DLD, as well as adults or individuals with DLD and dyslexia. I shouldn't say adults. We're just talking about our adult work here in Bath, and I am focused on that right now. So with that introduction, I'm going to hand over to Professor Krishnan. I'm going to stop sharing, but I will find the link for how to sign up to E-DLD and put that in the chat as well. So I'll hand it over to you, Saloni.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's really, really a pleasure to kind of be here. I know many of the names of people who are here, and also, of course, many people have participated in the studies, and E-DLD advertises a lot of our work, which we find incredibly useful, but we also find incredibly useful from the kind of development of research ideas angle. So thank you. And I hope I'll do some justice to the kind of like making sure that it's accessible, and please ask me questions and, tell me if I'm using jargon that you don't understand. So yeah, hopefully you can see my slides. Is that okay, Michelle?
Yeah, we
Perfect.
can see it now.
Great. So I was going to start off with just introducing what developmental language disorder is. I know for this crowd that, this is basically preaching to the converted, but I guess I wanted to say that this has really been the primary focus of my work for a very long time. And so DLD is basically a label which is characterizing children whose primary difficulty is in understanding or producing spoken language. And the reason I've been interested in DLD or language for a very long time is actually that I have a brother who is basically nonverbal. And so it's been really important and apparent to me for my entire life how language underlies many of the things many of us take for granted. And so I've had this interest. I basically went to speech and language therapy clinics as a child. That's where I kind of played. And then, of course, I trained as a speech and language therapist later. A couple of things about developmental language disorder that I still want to highlight. One is simply that it continues to be hidden. And I think stuff like Rattled, Engaged ELD has had a massive impact, I think, in terms of making sure that there's less the kind of hiddenness or more knowledge about language and the kind of impact language can have. But I think even now in my research, when we're like looking for children with language difficulties, it's not very apparent to teachers, to professionals that, language difficulties can be present and can be masked so very easily. One of the reasons that that's really also important is that we know that language difficulties have this sort of lifelong impact, right? So they can have impacts on things like academic achievement, on reading, and so on things like managing relationships, friendships. That comes up a lot in the children we talk to and parents we talk to. And then actually, Michelle, you talked about adults, and actually I have an interest in thinking about adults with DLD and kind of employment. And as part of this Young Academy project, the UK Young Academy project, we're actually looking at sort of neurodivergence in work. In one of my kind of little soapboxes is to make sure DLD is kind of included in that, because I think that if language difficulties are left unsupported, it can have these real consequences for people in the workplace as well. But today I'm going to talk about like what's been a real focus of my work, I think, for the last decade or so. And this is not my quote, this is from Emma James, but I wanted to try and illustrate why this is really important to me. So I think a lot of times when we think about like research priorities and DLD, etc., intervention and learning comes up as something that's very important. We know that, children with DLD will struggle with things like maybe vocabulary or grammar, and like how do we kind of support this? And I think Emma wrote this, and I think as soon as I read it, it really, really resonated with me. And the quote basically sort of suggests that knowing a child's area of weakness will actually be insufficient for intervention if we don't know how it came to be poor in the first place. And I think it really speaks to this idea of like, why we need to understand the mechanism so we can think about what we're designing and if we're designing the right things. And it's for this reason that I think I've had a real focus in thinking about learning and how children learn, and why some things like, let's say, poor vocabulary might be underpinned by kind of things around learning. So today I'm going to try and convince you that, children with DLD struggle with learning that involves sequences. And I think in particular, sequences that are in some nature linguistic. So obviously when we listen to language, this is kind of holding a lot of information in mind. Not everything is written, not everything is a slide. We don't have captions with us all of the time. And particularly when we have to do things that involve like, sequencing sound or sequencing information, this is something that we find that children with DLD historically in the literature have tended to have trouble with. And there are really nice examples from this, from a lot of people's work, but one example, for example, is sentence repetition, where you might hear a sentence like, before the students were dismissed for lunch, they were told by their teacher to hand in their assignments. And in order to kind of remember the sentence, you actually have to do a little bit of chunking to kind of make sure you can kind of group and remember this information. And for many of us, that's very natural, because we'll kind of use the grammatical properties of language as a way of forming those kind of chunks or remembering this very long sequence of sounds. For people with DLD, this tends to be more problematic, and this is partially because it really taps into things around grammar and working memory. But it's not just in sentences, but also in tasks like, oops, not sure why this is not out there. And also in tasks like non-word repetition. So in these cases, you actually have to remember a sequence of sounds. You might have a word like potlisterol or cat, and you're trying to kind of hold that information in memory and reproduce it. And we find that children with DLD generally don't do very well in these kinds of tasks, and they particularly don't do well when that kind of sequence of sounds is longer. And this is something that I've been kind of interested in. So why is it that, this kind of learning is different? This was actually an fMRI study that we did, and this is being analyzed by a PhD student with Kate Watkins and me, Nilgun Bahar, who's now postdoc at UCSF. I won't end up talking about the fMRI data from this particular study because it turns out it's complicated, but I just wanted to give you some insight into some of the behavioral findings, which hopefully illustrates this idea around kind of learning and why I think it's interesting to study learning. So in some sense, it's a very simple task. The children are basically told they're going to see some pictures of aliens. They'll hear the name of the alien and they just have to repeat it. So it's a non-word repetition task. The only kind of twist is that really in our task, some of these words repeat again. So you might kind of, whoops, I'm not sure why my mouse is being a little bit excited today. But for example, you might say a word like leppy, and then after a while, you'll see leppy again. After a while, you'll see leppy again. And after a while, you'll see leppy again. And they're not told that some of the words are actually repeating words, and some of them they only see once. And what we're interested in is a couple of things around word learning. One is this idea that, when you see this picture, will you kind of form a link between this particular alien picture and the word Sampa? The other thing is like what we know is that with children with DLD, two-syllable words, so Sampa, should be easier to repeat than something that is four syllables like Viscucleo. And so we're interested in thinking about what is the effect of kind of two versus four syllables, but also this kind of repetition. And we can look at this both from the learning of the word form, so like learning these sounds like for tenure, Viscucleo, etc., or from learning of the form meaning associations. Uh, Now, encouragingly, and I think this is actually what we were expecting based on the literature, this is about 36 children with DLD and age match kind of controls. When we look at kind of form referent mapping, so you see a picture of the alien and you have to choose which of these words goes with the alien after you've kind of done this task in the scanner. So you're doing this about an hour later or so. We find that actually children with DLD are pretty much as good as typically developing children in making those kinds of links. And the thing that you're seeing here is just NR and R, and that's basically just showing you that's the kind of repeated words that I was telling you about now design versus the non-repeated words. So as you might expect, words that are repeated are kind of recognized a bit better, but there are really no group differences here. So that's quite nice because it shows you that, some aspects of these learning are actually completely like normal in children with DLD, or at least at the group level. What's interesting though is, and as you might expect, when we look in the scanner at how children perform on saying those word forms, that's when we start to see differences. And so if I draw your attention to what you see in the kind of first instance, the lighter colors are the two-syllable words, the darker colors are the four-syllable words, and you can see the typically developing children in blue and the children in DLD in yellow. And what hopefully you can see is that, as we might expect, given what I said about the non-word repetition chart task, is that children with DLD are doing a little bit worse than neurotypical controls. They're not doing too badly. There's still an average of about like 70%, whereas children who are typically developing are sitting more at around 80%. What's nice though is that you can actually see that as they repeat, there's evidence of kind of improvement. So it's not a kind of like, there is no improvement that can be had. But you'll still see that the children with DLD are not kind of reaching the level of the neurotypical children, even within these four repetitions. The other thing that happens when you encounter these sequences is typically you get faster, right? You know a word, so you don't need to kind of plan and program it in the same way. And so actually you can see that over the kind of four repetitions that people get a little bit faster. And this is true for both the two and four syllable words in the neurotypical children and the children with DLD as well. And this actually sits somewhat nicely in kind of saying that maybe what children with DLD seem to be really having is a difference in kind of encoding, that initial kind of onset is the kind of problem. But after that, they seem to show improvement. They seem to show similar kind of types of learning. And people have also looked at things like consolidation and at least suggested that once words are encoded in memory, children with DLD are sort of as likely to remember them an hour later and even a week later. So that's one thing I wanted to draw your attention to. Is not all aspects of the word learning. It's one specific kind of aspect of the word learning. It really seems to be about this kind of sequencing, and it seems to be something that we should maybe be paying attention to. So back 2016, I actually did a review looking at different kinds of learning and trying to map this onto learning systems at the time. And at the time, I was interested in both linguistic and non-linguistic learning. And there wasn't that much literature, surprisingly, at the time, but I tried to code this thing in this sort of memory systems framework about declarative learning and non-declarative learning. And what you'll see is the tasks that I coded in red were tasks where children with DLD had been found to be different or learning less well than the neurotypical peers. And tasks shown in blue, like I showed you with that form referent learning, were kind of tasks where children with DLD were learning as well as kind of age-matched peers. And one thing that really seemed to stick out to me when I did this was that whenever that kind of learning involved something to do with a sequence, you tended to see kind of more impairment. So I thought that was really interesting. I should say that behaviorally, the picture has changed quite a lot now. And I think if I did the same diagram, it would look very, very different now. So I'm not saying that we should kind of like believe this, because I think that there's a lot more non-specificity and there's a lot more questioning about what is the value of these sequential impairments. But as a neuroscientist, from the brain level, this kind of gave me a hypothesis in terms of, what it is that we might expect in the brain of children with DLT that might be a little bit different. And what I'm going to argue is maybe that, at least when we started this off, that children with DLD would show brain differences in the sort of systems that support sequential learning. So as I said, we map these onto these memory systems of declarative and non-declarative learning. And actually in the brain literature, these are kind of associated with different neural structures. And in particular, this kind of procedural learning is really associated with the sort of brain systems to do with the kind of basal ganglia, or what's called the striatum. So if we think about the brain, it's got sort of like the cortex, which is the outer layer, but you still have gray matter, which is the active neurons that are really kind of doing the work. And there are these gray matter bundles that are kind of deep inside the brain as well. And some of the ones we seem to be really interested in that generally are responsible for this kind of procedural learning. And these might be things that are kind of considered habitual or things that you don't obviously verbalize. Like, for example, you might know to drive or you might know to ride a bicycle. But if someone asks you how you do that, you might not be completely sure. You just sort of learned it through experience. You kind of know what to do next. And so these particular systems seem to be really associated with, like, as you do things over and over again without really knowing it, you sort of extracted structure or patterns. And one idea is that this is also very important for language because there are many patterns that we're extracting in the kind of temporal domain. And this might be a way that we're kind of using and extracting those patterns. And so, so these particular systems seem to be really important for something called trial and error learning. So you basically do something, you have a consequence, and your brain is sort of updating its learning on the basis of that consequence. This is a little bit different to the kind of learning where I suggested, like, here's a picture, here's a name, and you join these two things together. Because in the kind of picture kind of a word mapping case, you're trying to map two different arbitrary stimuli together. There's no kind of consequence to these two things. Whereas in this kind of case, you're trying to say, okay, I do this, then I do this, then I do this, then you do this. And like, it has to be this kind of chain of actions. And this might be more kind of emergent from thinking about sequences. Like, I've got to say per, pli, st, wrong, and I have to sequence them in a particular pattern. Anyway, so we had this hypothesis that actually maybe for various reasons, especially given these kind of behavioral profile, maybe where we were going to see differences when these kind of in gray matter structures in the brain called the striatum. And we were very lucky because I think this was back in 2017. We got funding from the MRC to actually do this project. This was led by Kate Watkins and Dorothy Bishop, and was an absolute privilege to actually be a postdoc on this study. And you can see us on the day of the final scan, which I think was in December 2019. So we made it just before the end of the pandemic. And those are the final children that we scanned on the Oxbold study. Um, but what did we do? So actually what we did was we tried to get children into the scanner to try and understand if there are any differences in these brain pathways. And for those of you who may not have ever seen a scanner before, it's this kind of donut-like shaped. And one of our kids described it as like, you're the jam inside the donut, basically. So you kind of go on this bed, you go inside this donut, and we try and take pictures of what's happening. We can take different kinds of pictures. So we can use this to kind of interrogate like how the brain is working, but we can also look at, what is the structure of the brain. And I think sometimes when I describe brain structure, it's like we all have very similar faces, right? We generally have two eyes, nose, mouth, etc., in kind of similar configurations, but everyone is a little bit different. So while you have a representation of what a face might be, everyone has slightly different faces. And so what we're interested in is when we think about this kind of average representation of what a brain might look like, what specifically are the kind of differences in these structures. So this is the striatum, that's the caudate nucleus over there. And so on, and what kind of differences might be. We can also look at function, so what areas light up when you do a task. We can also look at connectivity, so what are the different brain areas that are kind of wired together. I won't go into every single thing that we've looked at in the BOLD study, but I just wanted to give you an example from one of these things that we did, where we tried to use this particular technique to really try and look at myelination and look at whether there was kind of variation or individual differences in myelination that were linked to language proficiency. Uh, and myelination is basically, again, quite a simple neural property. The idea is that around neurons, you have these kind of fatty sheets. And it's a little bit like insulation in your electric wires, right? When you have this fatty sheet, it basically makes that communication kind of faster. So more myelin traditionally is a better thing because you kind of get faster and more prioritized like transmission. Um, so one of the things we found in our study, which had this, we retained data from 33 children with DLD and 56 neurotypical children, is that we tended to find that we had more myelination kind of in children with who are neurotypical. And these tended to be in areas that we very much think of as being part of the language system, right? So this, I'm so sorry. This would be in things like the inferior frontal areas in ventral sensory motor cortex, which is really associated with like representations of the lip and face, in things like primary temporal areas and in areas associated with sort of semantics and so on. So quite left lateralized language processing areas. But one of the other things that we started to see even at this whole brain level is that we were seeing something in that striatal area that I was telling you about that's quite responsible for the sort of trial and error learning. And if I zoom in there, you can basically see that, in green, I'm showing you the typically developing group, and in orange are children with DLD. And while it's not a one-to-one case, there are definitely children with DLD who are pretty much have got as much striatal myelin as our neurotypical children. In general, we tended to see a group difference with kind of reduced myelination in the striatum. So again, if you think about what I was saying about sort of insulation, it just might be that in these particular areas of the brain, you're sort of seeing less of that insulation. So in terms of making things easier, in terms of learning habits, learning procedures, maybe the idea is that it's just a little bit slower and a slightly like, less kind of optimized in the brain for children with DLD. We also did some work to kind of look at whether instead of looking at categorical differences, whether we could just simply look at overall scores on a language proficiency, because we had a battery of language measures. And as you can see, this is quite strongly correlated with the left caudate nucleus. And in fact, that was the only region where we found this very strong correlation between language proficiency and myelination. So I set up this hypothesis, which was basically to say that, okay, we're going to be looking for these differences in the kind of anterior like striatum. And we did. We found these differences in the caudate nucleus. So that seems great. So we could potentially say then one conclusion would be that children with DLD do show these brain differences in the systems that support sequential learning. But as with any kind of science, it turns out the story isn't as simple as that. So one of the things is when we get these brain images, we not only get the kind of areas that we're interested in or we have hypotheses about, but we can also look at lots of different brain areas. And so if we looked at some of the brain areas that are associated with other kinds of learning, and I don't think you need to take too much away from here, except to say that our neurotypical children are in blue, our children with DLD are in yellow. And across the board, if you think about things like the volume of, say, the caudate nucleus and the putamen, which are very much part of that kind of striatum that I was telling you about, things like the globus pallidus, the thalamus, the hippocampus, which is actually part of the system that has to do with learning those kind of stimulus mappings, or the amygdala, you tend to see differences across the board, like including in the hippocampus, the thalamus, and the globus pallidus, right? So it's not something that seems to be just about the dorsal striatum. And indeed, my colleague Gabe Clare, who led this work, has actually shown that you can try and predict language proficiency. So we can take that measure of language prediction proficiency and try and use some of these measures to actually make a prediction about, what someone's language proficiency would be. And when you use these machine learning models, it turns out that the best fitting models are not necessarily the ones which just have one brain area. There's no kind of one-to-one mapping, but actually it's explained by a combination of things like, whether male or female. That seems to make a big difference. Being male is quite a high risk factor for having language difficulty. But then also things like the volume of your thalamus, the putamen, the hippocampus, and the caudate all contribute to that kind of prediction of language proficiency. So that's been a little bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I think what I wanted to try and convince you is that these learning systems are really important. We should be thinking about them. And they seem to make a real difference to the kind of overall language proficiency. And this sits somewhat differently to kind of adults. So when we think about adults who've had language difficulties, like those who have had aphasia or strokes, we tend to think about cortical areas and not so much about the learning systems. But in the developmental literature, it's been very clear that in children with DLD, we should be paying more attention to these learning systems. Um, while I was working with children in the BOLD study, one of the other things, though, that I was really thinking about was this idea of engagement and motivation. And at the heart of it, I'm a speech and language therapist, and I'm really interested in how we think about interventions, how we think about learning, and how we keep people on track with learning. And so I'd spend some time with the parents, kind of talking through like background questionnaires and things like that. And I would also ask them about the hobbies and interests of children with DLD. And there were lots of really, really interesting hobbies and interests. Choir came up a lot, woodworking, pottery, and so on. But some things that tended to come up much less were things like reading. So these were adolescents, 10 to 15-year-olds with DLD. They just didn't read as much as their neurotypical peers. Interestingly, many parents also said that their children avoided things like TV and audiobooks because they found these kind of language environments quite overwhelming. Uh, and I thought this was really interesting because, of course, we know that the best way to kind of learn language is to expose yourself to language, right? So if you are struggling with some of these patterns and so on, how can we kind of encourage people and make people a bit more motivated to engage with these environments that are clearly linguistic? And one of my questions here then started to be like, when we think about language learning, do children with DLD actually feel the same way about learning language and learning kind of new linguistic information? And I'll give you an example of this. So here's a task we're currently using in the lab, and you're going to hear some sentences, hopefully, if I manage to play them. And so read the sentence and you also hear it, and I want you to try and make a guess as to what dwib is.
She trimmed the ribbon with some dwib. She carefully cut out the shapes with dwib. I cut the string with some dwib.
Do people have any guesses? I guess I might not be able to see all of you, but hopefully many of you are thinking scissors. And usually what happens is as you kind of figure this out, oops, sorry, no, this is not what we want. Sorry, blooming buzzing confusion. But what generally happens is when you figure out that, that word has this meaning, I've understood it, you tend to find that people say that, oh, that was enjoyable, that was actually really pleasurable. You tend to see that you get brain activity in the area, so in the ventral striatum and ventral tegmental area, which are areas associated with reward processing. So these are areas that might also light up for like when someone gives you money, like when you win some money, or when like, you're eating a food you particularly like, and so on. And it's really interesting that in neurotypical adults, like when you learn these meanings, the words, you're quite confident about it, you actually see these same areas lighting up. And that seems to be a causal rule here, because you can give people dopaminergic medication that specifically targets these circuits, and you can actually find that you can enhance their learning on these medications, just very, very slightly. But one of the things we've been interested in the lab is that do we get the same kind of profile of activation? And we're still, this is quite early days, but I think that we're finding that even when children with DLD are kind of learning accurately, we find that they show us reduced enjoyment. So they actually report enjoying that learning much less than neurotypical children. And they're also much less confident in that learning. So even when they worked out the answer correctly, we asked them, how confident are you about that learning? They're reporting that their confidence is much lesser than neurotypical children. And this is really interesting because it means that, generally when we learn things, our own confidence is a kind of driver for like what we kind of pursue and how we feel about doing the next thing. So for me, my classic example is I'm not a very sporty person. And actually, you kind of lose that sense of self-efficacy or belief when I'm playing sport because someone throws a ball at me and I drop it and everyone's really upset with me. And so it's interesting that these intrinsic signals are kind of different for language learning in children with DLD. I should emphasize that I don't think that this is the cause of DLD. This is not what we should be addressing in some sense, but I think this is something we should be conscious of, that in these learning environments, children with DLD, even when they're doing the same task, and even when they're doing it correctly, are experiencing that learning slightly differently. And I guess then to end on a slightly more positive note, one of the things we've been thinking about is, are there ways we can support that experience and actually bolster that kind of enjoyment to potentially support learning? And so some work we've been doing in the lab is like looking at this idea of curiosity. Now, most of you in schools will know that curiosity is a very big thing. It's usually one of the school's values. We want curious kids who go out and explore and engage. And in these senses, we tend to think of curiosity as something that is about a person, right? Like this is a curious person, this is a less curious person. But actually, in the way I'm going to talk about curiosity, I want you to think of it as a state. So at some moments, you will be super curious, and at other moments, you might not be curious at all. And it's really about thinking about those times when you are very curious, what happens to your learning. And there's quite a lot of evidence from the kind of neuroscience literature that when you're in these states, if you really enjoy something or you're quite curious about something, you want to know the answer, that actually your kind of memory for that answer is enhanced, but also information you basically encounter incidentally in those times is also enhanced. And so in some work that is just being led by Sana Chuttai and my previous postdoc, Sonia Singh, we were trying to understand, can we actually harness curiosity in children with DRD to kind of support learning? And we've done this through a fairly simple experiment. So we're looking at 8 to 11-year-olds, and we actually expose them to kind of new material for years 5 to 6 within the categories of science, geography, music, general knowledge, things that they might encounter at school. And so our task looks a little bit like this. So they would have these kind of questions. What is the name of this fungus? What does this word mean? So things that are actually quite both not language-based and quite language-based. And then we would just ask them, how curious are you about the answer? We wouldn't give them the answers at this point. We just ask them how curious they are. And so they rate all of this. And then they get to play a little game. So they actually get to say, okay, they see these questions again, and they can either kind of skip and say, I don't really want to know the answer. I want to go on to the next thing. I'm going to wait and try and find out what that answer is. And if they decide to wait, they're going to wait for somewhere between 10 to 25 seconds. And if you've ever, been on YouTube and kind of had to wait through those ads, you'll kind of know the feeling of what this is like. Or they can actually just say, I know this already, so I don't care. So so if they say they want to skip or no, they will go straight on to the next question and they can decide what to do there. But if they decide to wait, then they get the answer. And if you are interested, this was an orange peel fungus, which apparently kids find really interesting. They love this fungus. And then they can also rate how satisfied they are with this answer. 1 week later, we then test their information, their memory for this information. And so we ask them, like, what was the name of this fungus, or what does this word mean? And while they're doing this memory test, they basically get ticks and wrongs in terms of whether they got the answer correct or not. So we had 2 questions here. One was that, and the reason I'm presenting this in this particular way is our results are still pretty preliminary, and we want to treat language as a kind of continuous variable. So basically, the green in this case are showing you children in our particular sample who are, on the upper end of language, and the red in our case are showing you children who are sort of on the lower end of language. But they're not actually grouped up into these things, so it's just a visualization thing to be able to show you this. But what I'm showing you here is that when children are curious about information, whether it was the word or the picture, doesn't seem to make a big difference. But in general, when they're curious, they're much more likely to wait for the answer, which makes sense, right? Like if you truly are curious about something, you would want to know the answer to it. We see that this is somewhat reduced in the children with lower language abilities. So there's an interaction here. So kind of more curiosity leads to more waiting. This is somewhat attenuated in our children with kind of lower language ability. But it's still quite significant, even accounting for this interaction. What's really interesting, though, is if you look at memory 1 week later, so we generally find that the children at the lower end of the language ability are kind of poorer in their learning, but look what's happening when they're curious. So actually, there's a really nice pattern here, so that the more curious you are, actually, the better you sort of retain that information. And this seems to be maintained at all levels of language ability. So here, there isn't an interaction. This is actually just saying that, curiosity seems to act in a very similar way for everyone in terms of enhancing this kind of learning. And actually, people looking at this in slightly different domains, like from ADHD, etc., are starting to find really similar effects where almost like, curiosity can kind of bolster the effect of like, perhaps not paying attention or perhaps having some language challenges. So it seems like curiosity might be able to boost learning, and importantly, it's doing this at all levels of language ability. So I felt like that was hopefully a really exciting and nice note to end on, to give many of you something to really think about. With that, I want to say thank you to people in the lab who have done lots of this work, and also to our funders, and really, really importantly, to any of you in the audience who might have participated or thought about participating in our studies. We just can't do the work without you. We are running a current study. You've probably heard about it on Engage DLD already, but if you know a child with DLD aged 8 to 11, we're running an MRI study. So please get in touch if this is something you're interested in. But yeah, with that, I'm just going to say thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Saloni. What we're going to do now, I'm going to end the poll. I can get that out of my space. I'm going to stop the recording and then we can have some Q&A sessions. So just give me a minute. Stop recording.